Welcome to Inside East African Politics. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a situation that's generating significant concern, really, across the Horn of Africa. The central question we're exploring is a critical one. Are Ethiopia and Eritrea, two nations bound by this long, very tumultuous history and, well, a recent, incredibly fragile peace, are they once again on the brink of open warfare? Our mission today is to try and cut through the swirling reports, the conflicting statements. We want to help you understand the crucial historical context, maybe dissect the immediate triggers of the current tensions, and really grasp what's truly at stake for the region, so you can be well informed on this profoundly important dynamic.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how deeply rooted these tensions are in history. It's almost like old wounds that, despite attempts at healing, are now being pushed almost violently to the surface by very recent developments. Understanding that intricate historical backdrop is absolutely vital to comprehending what's happening right now.
Okay, let's unpack this complex history then. For nearly 2 decades, Ethiopia and Eritrea were locked in what really felt like an endless Cold War. And this animosity, it was a direct legacy of that brutal 1998-2000 border war. A conflict that erupted just, 5 years after Eritrea gained its independence from Ethiopia in 1993.
That's right.
That war, it claimed tens of thousands of lives. It didn't just end a conflict, it severed all communication ties, closed transport routes, and basically erected this huge wall of mistrust between the two neighbors. It was a truly dark period.
And this period was marked by just a complete cessation of normal relations. I mean, families were divided, trade ground to a halt. The very idea of traveling between the two countries just became a distant memory for people. The border, which was once a place of, everyday interaction, it became this heavily militarized no man's land, a stark symbol of that frozen conflict.
Right.
And the economic and human cost of this prolonged standoff was just immense. It impacted livelihoods. It fostered really deep-seated resentment on both sides.
But then 2018 happened. And something genuinely astonishing unfolded. I mean, it really felt like a moment that promised to rewrite that narrative of conflict. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki declared this historic rapprochement. The world watched as communication links were restored. There was all this optimistic talk of demolishing a wall of mistrust, and Ethiopian Airlines even started flying to Asmara again.
Yeah.
For many, it felt like a true turning point. A breakthrough that really defied decades of animosity.
And what's particularly striking about that period, and something that adds to the current complexity, is that Eritrean troops, quite unexpectedly, fought alongside Ethiopian forces. They fought against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, during Ethiopia's own devastating civil war from 2020 to 2022.
A very unlikely alliance.
A very unlikely alliance, yeah. Forged against a shared adversary, it seemed to cement that newfound peace. However, if we connect this to the broader picture, despite that initial hopeful moment in 2018 and even that tactical alliance in Tigray, relations had actually already cooled significantly by late 2022.
Really?
That soon, yeah. A key indicator of this deteriorating trust, was Eritrea's conspicuous exclusion from the Pretoria peace talks. Those were the talks that ultimately ended the Tigray War.
And that exclusion wasn't just a diplomatic slight, was it? It left a lot of unresolved issues just simmering beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
And adding to the concern, there were reports that some Eritrean military units remained stationed in Tigray even after the peace agreement was signed. That directly contradicted the terms reached in Pretoria. That partial implementation, leaving an unaddressed foreign military presence, it felt like a ticking time bomb.
It really did. The continued presence of Eritrean forces in Tigray, despite the agreement stipulating their withdrawal, was a glaring violation. It undermined the very foundation of the Pretoria Accord. It signaled to many that, maybe Eritrea wasn't fully committed to the spirit of the peace, or perhaps had its own lingering objectives in the region.
Right.
This lack of full adherence definitely fostered deep suspicion. And then fast forward to early 2025, and the warnings from the ground became stark. Impossible to ignore. Officials in northern Ethiopia's Tigray region, the very area impacted by this lingering Eritrean presence, began stating flat out that the neighbors were on the brink of war.
Wow.
And then on March 13th of 2025, General Sotkin Gebretense, who's a prominent figure, a vice president of Tigray's interim administration, he was quoted delivering this chilling assessment. He warned that, and I quote, "At any moment, war between Ethiopia and Eritrea could break out."
That's not just speculation. That's a senior regional official sounding a very urgent alarm. So the general's warning was stark. What specifically were the immediate triggers for this surge in alarm right then on the ground?
Well, it came amid these serious internal clashes within Tigray itself.
Yeah.
You had a hardline TPLF faction pushing for a return to greater autonomy. They were fiercely critical of the federally backed interim government that's the new administration installed post-war, accusing it of selling out Tigrayan interests, basically compromising too much with Addis Ababa.
Okay.
This internal fracture saw the hardline TPLF faction, led by Debretsion Gebremichael, seizing key towns in northern Tigray. That essentially ignited a new wave of internal conflict.
Right, so fighting within Tigray itself.
Exactly. And the Tigray interim administration, the one under Getachew Reda, then desperately appealed to Addis Ababa for federal support. They described their own internal situation as on the brink of another crisis.
And this internal struggle within Tigray, it adds this deeply worrying dimension to the broader Ethiopia-Eritrea dynamic, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. While Eritrea's government has publicly denied any involvement in this Tigrayan infighting, Ethiopia's federal authorities have countered with accusations. They claim these hardline dissidents are, in fact, collaborating with Asmara.
Ah, so proxy conflict fears.
Precisely. These accusations, each side pointing fingers at the other for stoking conflict in Tigray, have dramatically amplified fears. Instead of acting as allies, like they did during the Civil War, the two armies could very easily find themselves on opposite sides of a renewed, devastating conflict. Simply by backing different factions within Tigray, it turns a domestic dispute into a potential international flashpoint.
Okay, so beyond the immediate internal disputes and these accusations we just discussed, what's the deeper, maybe even more fundamental ambition driving these heightened anxieties and the escalating rhetoric?
Well, the most significant underlying issue, the one that actually predates these recent events and even the Tigray conflict, is Ethiopia's long-standing quest for Red Sea access.
Right, the landlocked issue.
Exactly. This isn't just about economic necessity, though that's huge. It seems to encompass these profound historical aspirations, a deeply felt sense of national destiny almost. Ethiopia has been landlocked ever since Eritrea's independence in 1993. That means it pays roughly, get this, $1 billion annually just to use Djibouti's port.
$1 billion. That's an enormous sum, a significant economic burden, and a strategic vulnerability, too.
It is. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has repeatedly and quite forcefully called access to the sea an existential right for Ethiopia.
Existential. That's strong language.
Very strong. And he's been actively pursuing new port agreements, including that highly contentious one in January 2024 with breakaway Somaliland.
Ah, yes, the Berbera port deal.
That's the one. Somaliland functions independently but lacks international recognition. That move really enraged Somalia's government, which views Somaliland as its sovereign territory. It led Mogadishu to sever relations with Addis Ababa. It just shows how sensitive and far-reaching Ethiopia's quest for sea access has become.
It truly does. And what does existential truly mean in this context for Ethiopia? You mentioned it's more than just economics.
I think it is. It seems to encompass historical aspirations. You hear open talk among some Ethiopians of reclaiming historic ties to the coastal Dahlak Islands, which are part of Eritrea, or even the Eritrean port of Assab, which was once Ethiopia's primary maritime outlet.
I see.
These ambitions, rooted in historical narratives, are understandably viewed by Asmara as a direct and very grave challenge to its hard-won sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So this deeply felt national aspiration in Ethiopia directly clashes with Eritrea's fierce protectiveness of its independence, creates this kind of zero-sum game that feels inherently volatile.
That's a good way to put it, a zero-sum game.
Which makes Abiy's public statements even more complex and, frankly, quite contradictory at times. In Parliament on March 20th, 2025, he stated Ethiopia had no intention of engaging in conflict with Eritrea for the purpose of gaining access to the sea and would pursue dialogue. Okay. Yet, almost in the next breath, he warned that failure to resolve the issue peacefully could make it destined to be settled by force. That latter part was certainly perceived, with great alarm, as a thinly veiled threat by many Eritreans. It significantly escalated the rhetoric.
And Eritrean leaders responded with even blunter rhetoric, showing their extreme displeasure. Foreign Minister Osman Saleh publicly denounced Ethiopia's, quote, misguided and outdated ambitions for a Red Sea port. He accused Addis Ababa of warmongering psychosis. He called for immediate international pressure to compel Ethiopia to respect Eritrean sovereignty, basically signaling we're not negotiating this.
No room for discussion there.
Pretty much. Eritrea's information minister, Yamani Gebremichael, also insisted the country had no aggressive intentions, framing Ethiopia as the aggressor. At the same time, Eritrea has been making strategic moves. In October 2024, it signed a security pact with Egypt and Somalia.
Ah, Egypt and Somalia. Interesting alignment.
Very interesting. It's widely seen as a direct counterweight to Ethiopia's Red Sea ambitions. And it's worth noting, Egypt itself has its own long-standing rivalry with Ethiopia over Nile waters.
Right, the GERD dam issue.
Exactly. So that adds yet another intricate layer to these regional power dynamics and this sort of unfolding maritime security chessboard.
So we've seen the historical roots, the driving forces like sea access, but what about the visible signs of escalation on the ground now and the diplomatic strain? What are we seeing in terms of military movements?
Well, what's fascinating here is the array of signals being sent, both overt and subtle, by both sides. We've seen deeply concerning reports of military mobilizations. Human rights concern Eritrea, which is a reliable monitoring group, reported Asmara issuing broad conscription orders for men under 60 in recent months.
Under 60, that's significant.
Very. It's a measure typically reserved for periods of grave national threat. And Reuters, the news agency, corroborated this, confirming Eritrea's nationwide military mobilization by mid-February 2025, a big indicator of heightened alert.
And how did Ethiopia respond to that level of mobilization?
Ethiopia, in turn, has reportedly been moving its own troops and tanks toward the Eritrean frontier in response.
Okay.
Now, while no direct clashes have been officially reported between the two armies, the sheer scale and proximity of these deployments creates an extremely volatile situation. Analysts warn this heavy concentration of forces significantly raises the risk of miscalculation.
Yeah, one mistake.
Exactly. Even a small, unintended incident could rapidly trigger a wider confrontation, precisely because so many armed personnel are now in such close proximity in a disputed, highly sensitive border region. One foreign diplomat, while assessing that the risk of conflict was unlikely for now, still acknowledged it was a significant escalation.
The diplomatic signals are just as worrying, aren't they?
They absolutely are. Diplomatically, Eritrea abruptly froze all Ethiopian Airlines flights last year.
Just stop them.
Just stop them. A highly visible snub, halting the passenger service that had only restarted in 2018 as a symbol of that rapprochement. It sent a clear message that Asmara felt the relationship was seriously backsliding.
Wow.
President Isaias' government also lodged formal protests against Abiy's statements, and even against a contentious display of a map at an African Union summit. Apparently, the map controversially appeared to show Eritrean territory as Ethiopian. Oh, that would not go down well. Definitely not. These actions underscore just how sensitive Eritrea is to any perceived challenge to its sovereignty. In Addis Ababa, on the other hand, lawmakers recently extended the mandate of the Tigray interim administration in line with the Pretoria Agreement, and Abiy reaffirmed Ethiopia's commitment to that peace deal in March.
So trying to signal adherence to prior agreements even as tensions rise with Eritrea.
Kind of a mixed message situation, perhaps.
Yeah. So neither side has formally broken diplomatic ties again, which I guess is a small comfort, but communication is clearly strained. We're hearing that phone and email contact between the capitals is limited, maybe practically non-existent in some cases. And Eritrea has become increasingly isolated internationally, which surely limits avenues for de-escalation.
It does.
And this entire situation has naturally drawn widespread international concern. Sudan, Djibouti, both neighbors, have explicitly expressed worry that a regional war would further destabilize an already volatile Horn of Africa. The African Union, the EU, the US, the UN, they've all called for restraint, urging dialogue.
Indeed. And former U.S. and EU envoys Peyton Knopf and Alexander Rondos, they even issued this stark warning in a foreign policy commentary. They said the situation is dry tinder waiting for a match, really emphasizing the extreme fragility.
Dry tinder waiting for a match. That's chilling.
It is. Meanwhile, Eritrea has been working to cultivate ties with allies in the Gulf and the Arab world. We mentioned the meeting with Egypt's president to discuss Red Sea security. It seems they're aiming to broaden their support base, counter Ethiopia's influence. Eritrea has also continued to publicly downplay the idea of imminent conflict, even as evidence of mobilization mounts. It's a confusing picture.
And the international response.
Well, United Nations Security Council briefing on the Horn of Africa in early 2025, while noting the heightened tensions, offered only pretty muted public appeals for dialogue. For many observers, that felt insufficient given the gravity of the situation. It highlights a challenge the international community faces in exerting real influence over two highly nationalistic, often intractable governments.
So what does all of this mean for the immediate future? I mean, analysts seem quite divided on whether this could truly explode into open warfare or if it's just a very dangerous game of brinkmanship.
Yeah, and this raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. What are the real deterrents that might prevent full-scale war? And conversely, what are the catalysts that could push these nations over the edge? On one hand, there are very strong arguments against war. The immense costs would be crippling for both nations, particularly given their current internal challenges.
Right.
Ethiopia is already grappling with ongoing rebellions in its key Amhara and Oromia regions. That's straining its resources, its manpower. The country also relies heavily on foreign aid and debt relief, which would almost certainly be jeopardized by a new conflict.
And Eritrea's situation is arguably even more precarious economically, isn't it?
Absolutely. Eritrea's tiny, centrally controlled economy, already strained by decades of military conscription and international sanctions, simply couldn't absorb the immense costs of a prolonged war. Such a conflict would be financially ruinous, could trigger internal instability. As one seasoned Horn analyst put it very concisely, neither side can really afford this.
Neither side can afford this. That makes sense.
And some diplomats, as Reuters reported back in late 2024, viewed the flight suspension and the sharp rhetoric more as warning signals, designed to gain leverage, perhaps, rather than concrete signs of an imminent attack. The thinking being, maybe, they're talking tough, but they can't actually go through with it.
That's a strong argument for caution, suggesting maybe a strategic dance rather than an immediate plunge into violence. But on the other hand, many fear that the entanglement of unresolved border claims, this deeply ingrained fierce nationalism on both sides, and these frozen conflicts, makes the whole situation extremely brittle. The slightest misstep, the smallest miscalculation, could unravel the fragile peace we still technically have.
That's the fear. And even quiet efforts from the U.S. and EU are underway, reportedly urging Ethiopia to revise its public positions on Eritrea, maybe tone down the sea access rhetoric, and genuinely encourage dialogue. At the same time, they're also advising Eritrea to completely withdraw any remaining troops from Ethiopia's soil, as stipulated by the peace agreement, to try and remove a key point of friction.
So these diplomatic efforts highlight the deep concern that the situation remains highly volatile.
Definitely. The unresolved border issues from the 1998-2000 war, coupled with Ethiopia's renewed assertive stance on sea access, and those internal dynamics within Tigray risking a proxy battle. It all contributes to this inherent instability. It's a landscape that feels ripe for unintended escalation. So for now, yes, Ethiopia and Eritrea officially remain at peace. But it feels like a peace hanging by the thinnest of threads.
If we connect this to the bigger picture then, the current crisis seems ironically rooted in the very agreements and political shifts that were meant to secure peace. You have the partial, contentious implementation of the Pretoria deal. You have the recalibrated and deeply fractured Tigrayan politics. And you have Ethiopia's increasingly assertive nationalism driven by this quest for sea access.
It's a paradox, isn't it?
Right.
These elements, while maybe intended for stability or national progress, have somehow become profound sources of friction and instability.
History certainly warns us that a small miscalculation, maybe some Eritrean conscripts inadvertently crossing a disputed borderline, or maybe Ethiopian forces pressing farther into contested highlands in Tigray could escalate incredibly rapidly.
Yes.
In the volatile landscape of the Horn, where these deep-seated grievances and unfulfilled ambitions just linger, many worry that the region may yet be pushed into another catastrophe of war.
And that's precisely what international mediators are desperately straining to prevent, recognizing the absolutely devastating consequences it would have for millions of people.
So, for you, the listener, the crucial question remains. How can peace, once so carefully negotiated, so hard-won, become the very ground where new, terrifying conflicts seem to take root? Understanding these dynamics is crucial for anyone watching the Horn of Africa. We hope this deep dive has helped you grasp the intricate layers of this critical situation. Thanks for joining us.